In the peaceful town of Haven Falls, the gentle Miller couple became innocent victims of a shocking crime that shattered their world. The local mafia's cold influence, embodied by those who preyed on the defenseless, seemed untouchable and above any consequence. But no one suspected their quiet son James would return with the courage and skills to challenge the darkness and restore hope to the community. Discover how one man's quest for justice transformed not only his own fate, but the destiny of an entire town. This story's ending is one you'll never forget. The evening began like any other in Haven Falls, a place where time seemed to unspool a bit slower, threading golden minutes into gentle hours. Henry and Dolores Miller relished the quiet rhythms of their days, finding meaning in the simplest everyday gestures. Their home, a tidy clapboard house on Elm Street, was filled with the sort of peace that can only be earned through decades of patience, hard work, and faith in the goodness of others. As dusk settled, Dolores slipped on her favorite cardigan and took her time watering the flowers. She moved carefully between freshly planted tulips and a row of sun-drenched marigolds, pausing to admire a hummingbird hovering by the feeder. Dolores smiled, thinking how these fragile glimpses of beauty had colored her life with hope. Henry, already inside, watched his wife from the kitchen window while flipping the pages of the local newspaper. He enjoyed following the town gossip, reading about parades, school fundraisers, and letters to the editor. Though his hair had silvered and his hands had grown rough with age, his gaze still brightened every time Dolores entered the room. The heart of the Miller home was the kitchen, where warmth and laughter were as much the evening staple as Henry's homemade stew. As the air outside cooled, Dolores joined her husband at the worn oak table, and together they shared stories, memories of trips taken long ago, recollections of Henry's childhood spent catching tadpoles near Willow Creek, and tales of their son James, who as a boy had covered every inch of the house with crayon-drawn superheroes. James was their pride. Even after all his years away in the service, they still set his place at the table out of habit, just in case he walked in on a whim. Henry stirred his tea and glanced over at a shelf crowded with small keepsakes. A faded baseball mitt that once belonged to James, a teacup with a tiny chip from their 25th anniversary, and a photograph from a family camping trip sat side by side. The picture had been taken on a summer evening, just after the rain. James, muddy but grinning, stood with his arms around his parents, their tent like a bright patch of belonging behind them. That image, so full of light and togetherness, never failed to make Dolores's heart ache with longing and gratitude in equal measure. Tonight the phone rang just once. Dolores answered, hope sparkling in her eyes, but it was only a neighbor with a question about the upcoming bake sale. She gave recipes and instructions, then promised to bring extra ginger cookies, everyone's favorite. After the call, Henry reminded her not to fret about the small things. Their son, after all, had always found a way to call home, no matter where in the world the army sent him. After dinner, they gathered the cats into the living room and turned on the radio. Soft jazz filled the house, mingling with the sound of Dolores humming and Henry's quiet reading. They treasured this routine, the comfort in each other's steady presence, the sense that life would always return to this safe, steady moment. Dolores kept notes on a pad near the phone, jotting ideas for charity drives and names of neighbors who might need a casserole brought by after surgery or a bout of cold weather. The world is changed by small kindnesses, she often said, a lesson her parents had passed to her, and one she hoped James carried with him. As the evening wore on, the streets grew hushed, lights flickered out up and down the block, and only the Miller house remained aglow. Dolores folded clean laundry in the bedroom while Henry tidied the kitchen. The gentle hum of ordinary life seemed an anchor in the uncertain world outside, proof that even in times of worry or unrest there remained corners where goodness thrived. Before heading to bed, Henry opened the window for a breath of night air. "Sleep well, darling," he said, pressing a kiss to Dolores's forehead. "Tomorrow we'll plant those new rose bushes." Dolores smiled, already seeing in her mind the bright petals that would bloom in the sunlight. She lay beside her husband, a book in her hands, the cats curled at her feet. The clock ticked steadily, marking another quiet day's close. In the quiet dark of the Miller home, there was no sense of threat. Their hearts, while touched by sorrow for an absent son and longing for his return, felt full-rooted in each other, in their village, and in the calm assurance that goodness, even if humble and unseen, was its own sort of lasting legacy. And so another peaceful night settled over Haven Falls, resting gently upon two people who had spent a lifetime making the world around them just a little bit kinder. James Miller arrived in Haven Falls beneath a slate-gray sky that hung heavy with rain. News of his parents' passing reached him like a cold wind, unexpected, disorienting, and sharp. He walked through the streets in silence, his steps measured and eyes guarded, the weight of grief bearing down with each familiar landmark. The town, in mourning, watched him with reverence. Residents remembered him as a boy riding bicycles with friends in the summer, and years later, as a disciplined man returning from distant tours of duty. Now he moved not with the casual energy of youth or the camaraderie of service, but with the solitary resolve of someone facing loss alone. James entered the family home, pausing at the door to collect himself. The house was unchanged, the gentle clutter in the hallway, the faint scent of his mother's lavender sachets, his father's boots resting by the door, but the sense of absence was overpowering. He stepped inside and found the kitchen untouched save for a stray teacup and a half-finished crossword puzzle. Photographs gazed back at him from the walls, and as the rain tapped quietly against the window, James was reminded of childhood mornings spent listening to his parents talk softly in the next room. Here, the world had always felt secure. Now it was quiet, and the silence had a different edge. At the funeral service, James stood apart from the crowd, his posture straight but his shoulders tense. Community members came to share condolences, recounting acts of kindness his parents had carried out for years. A neighbor told stories about Dolores's legendary pies. A church deacon described Henry's meticulous repairs to the sanctuary roof. James nodded, grateful for these memories, but he knew none of them could ease the hollowness he felt. He wondered if, after everything he'd seen in service, he could ever truly recover from a loss so rooted in home rather than duty. Returning home that evening, James sat alone in the living room. The cats wandered in, seeking the gentle hands they had always known, now met with quiet pats and silent comfort. While rain continued to fall, James reviewed the circumstances surrounding his parents' passing. What troubled him more than anything was the realization that, in Haven Falls, answers might not be forthcoming. He went through the motions, spoke with police, attended meetings with local officials, but sensed a reluctance that reminded him of darker moments in his military career, when resolution depended not on hope but on action. Days turned into nights, and James began to notice subtle shifts around town. Whispers circulated about the circumstances of the tragedy, and rumors grew about the involvement of powerful local figures. James listened carefully during errands, piecing together fragments of truth from casual remarks and worried faces. He spent hours pacing his childhood bedroom, considering the options available to a man who had survived the world's most difficult places, but now faced the challenge of seeking justice within his hometown. James's motivation deepened with each day. He remembered his parents not only as gentle souls, but as principled people. Their legacy was rooted in acts of quiet courage, standing up for neighbors, pressing for honesty, welcoming outsiders without prejudice. The more he reflected, the more determined he became to honor them through actions rather than words. This resolve was not born of anger alone, but from a sense of duty that transcended personal pain. For James, there was no question of resignation. The memory of his parents demanded persistence, demanded justice. He began to keep a notebook, filled with observations and clues, names mentioned in passing, and details that felt out of place. He watched the movements of those who held sway in Haven Falls, those whose influence could offer protection or encumber progress. He noticed old patterns on marked vehicles parked near the courthouse, officials who avoided his polite questions. The ability to analyze and remain patient, honed during years of military service, was now put to use in dusty streets and quiet corners of his hometown. James took long walks along the edge of town after dark, retracing the paths of his youth, but now with a different purpose. The landscape, once filled with innocence and laughter, had become the site of investigation, every detail a potential key. His discipline never wavered, even as exhaustion pressed in, even as grief threatened to consume him. Each morning began with a quiet meditation, each evening ended with new notes and a revised plan. He stayed focused not on retribution, but on resolution, the hope that by facing difficulty head-on, he could restore not just his own peace of mind, but a sense of safety for all of Haven Falls. Through these persistent efforts, the town began to shift. Old friends and new acquaintances recognized the steadiness in James's eyes, the careful way he asked questions, and the quiet urgency that underlay his words. Some began to offer information hesitantly at first, then with growing trust. Others simply thanked him for his presence, seeing in James a reminder of what the Millers had meant to their community. As James moved forward, his love for his parents remained the guiding force behind every step. The pain of their absence did not dull. Instead, it became the source of motivation, compelling him toward the answers he sought and the justice they deserved. In the quiet hours between, tea poured in the empty kitchen, and the sound of a radio drifting through empty rooms, James made a silent vow to honor Henry and Dolores as they would have wanted, with courage, perseverance, and unwavering dedication to what was right. The story of one family's gentle goodness had become for James a mission stronger than any he had undertaken before. James Miller had learned to move with quiet purpose, blending observation with patience. The calm suburban streets of Haven Falls, once places of childhood adventure, now felt charged with hidden meaning. He noticed every small irregularity, cars parked in the same place too often, figures moving hurriedly after dusk, unspoken tension on familiar faces. Years of service had trained him to read details like a language, and the story unfolding here was one of fear and silence. He began visiting local spots daily, the diner his parents had loved, the hardware store, the park bench under the elm. Conversations came naturally at first, but his quiet questions started to uncover discomfort among the townsfolk. Some avoided eye contact, while others seemed relieved to talk. Little by little, trust built around him, a battered notebook filled with names, times, and subtle connections. One mechanic described strangers paying in cash for borrowed vehicles. A librarian recalled missing financial reports linked to city projects. Nothing proved anything outright, but every line strengthened the pattern James sensed. By night he walked the quiet streets alone, thoughts replaying every scrap of evidence. Haven Falls appeared peaceful on the surface, porch lights glowing, dogs barking faintly, but the stillness felt strained. Somewhere behind those drawn curtains plans were being made, and James knew he was quietly closing in. He felt no anger now, only duty. His parents' kindness had always been rooted in belief that good persisted even in darkness. He meant to honor that belief through action. The quiet stir his efforts caused grew day by day. People began sharing small truths with him. Nothing loud, nothing public, just steady acknowledgement that the peace they lived in had not been as genuine as it seemed. And though James rarely spoke of his progress, the calm determination in his eyes told those who met him that change was no longer a matter of chance. It was only a matter of time. The first light of morning brought a gentle haze to the gardens of Haven Falls, where the world seemed to breathe a little easier after so many weeks of unrest. James Miller stood quietly beneath the arch of his mother's roses, the dew glistening on delicate petals, as if the garden, too, was waking from a night of sorrow. Birds called softly from the willow. For a moment everything held its breath, a feeling familiar to any soldier, but new in this place, where peace had always been the background note of life. James felt the shift in the town before he saw it. Neighbors who had kept their shades drawn and voices hushed now waved from open doors and lingered on porches with morning coffee. Children returned to the streets with laughter and bicycles, their games echoing the innocence that once filled his own boyhood. Mrs. Turner, whose arthritis had kept her house dark for days, called to him with a trembling voice, offering a pie Dolores had taught her to bake years ago. The warmth in Haven Falls had begun to spread, quiet and slow, like sunlight reappearing after a long storm. Inside the Miller home, James moved through rooms layered with memories: his father's worn tool bench, the shelf of novels Dolores loved, a box of old letters tied with blue ribbon. Each corner was a chapter of lives spent believing in decency, holding faith when proof was scarce. James felt their presence as he tidied, repaired a broken lamp, and set fresh flowers on the table. In these acts his grief found purpose. Each gesture was a way of thanking them, a way of carrying their legacy forward. The investigation reached a turning point as James's steady work stirred forces beyond his intentions. He had never wanted acclaim. His motivation grew from the values learned in these very rooms. Yet the community, seeing his unwavering resolve and the quiet dignity of his search, began to demand more from its leaders. Town hall meetings grew crowded, residents voicing hopes and grievances. The mayor faced questions not heard in decades. Local reporters came out of retirement to document the process. The presence of James, his measured persistence, his refusal to bend transformed private worries into public accountability. Law enforcement, now under scrutiny, gathered evidence alongside James, revisiting sites and records previously ignored. Town officials showed new transparency, compelled by the community's newfound unity. Even old rivalries faded as the shared desire for truth and renewal took precedence over past divisions. James found himself the recipient of a quiet respect, a look in the eyes of young officers, a handshake from the county judge that required no words. In the weeks that followed, signs of healing emerged everywhere. The garden at Dolores's church overflowed with donations and volunteers. The annual summer picnic, threatened by despair, blossomed into a celebration that honored the Millers with stories and song. Children planted a line of maple saplings beside the elementary school, naming each tree after a neighbor lost to grief or fear, and hoping that roots would outlast tragedy. James became the confidant to many. Residents brought him tokens of gratitude: a handmade quilt, jars of preserves, handwritten notes slotted under his door. Often these gifts were unexpected and shy, not declarations of heroism, but gestures of shared hope. The mechanic down the street, who once seemed distant, now looked James in the eye and spoke honestly about the future. The librarian, whose secret note had first pointed to hidden truths, began to organize literacy nights and discussions on strength and community. Even the young people of Haven Falls, those whose worlds had been shaped more by anxiety than trust, found ways to participate, reporting small changes and offering new ideas. For James, these days were bittersweet. The sense of accomplishment mingled with the ache of absence, the vivid yearning for what could never fully return. Yet his parents' memory was everywhere, woven into each act of kindness, each commitment to truth, each tender moment of reconnection. In their garden, James planted a circle of wildflowers just outside the kitchen window, symbols of resilience and unity that would return with every season. On his final morning, James visited the resting place of Henry and Dolores beneath the largest oak in town. He knelt to clear away last night's fallen leaves, set a fresh bouquet between their names, and spoke quietly about all that had changed. He described the town's new energy, the growing bond among its people, the healing ripples of justice carried forward in ordinary days. With each word, he felt more certain that the Millers' lives marked by service, humility, and love had seeded something far greater than memory. A small group gathered as James prepared to leave. Friends, neighbors, young families bundled against the morning chill. They wanted to thank him, but mostly they wanted to say goodbye. He touched each hand in farewell, offering words of gratitude and reminders to care for one another. He promised to return someday, when the world felt easier and the garden bloomed full again. As the train rumbled away from Haven Falls, the landscape receded, a tapestry of streets, gardens, laughter, quiet dreams. James watched the town slip into distance with no bitterness, carrying in his heart the strength he had found. Out the window the sun climbed higher, lighting fields and fences, a promise of resilience, a tribute to the legacy of two gentle souls whose belief in kindness had sown hope for generations to come. And as James journeyed onward, he knew Haven Falls would endure, changed and healing, its story no longer confined to shadows, but told in every act of courage, every moment of faith. Every day someone chose to believe in goodness despite what the world had tried to take away.